Hello, I'm Arthur Kent. Welcome to History Undercover. The Second World War was almost over when a small American patrol escort exploded a few miles off the coast of Maine, killing 49 sailors. The Navy's official report said the blast was caused by a faulty boiler, but the surviving crewmen never believed that explanation. They claimed that their ship was destroyed by a German torpedo. Was it an accident or an act of war? That question haunted the families of the dead, who waited nearly 60 years before finally getting their answer. Join us as History Undercover presents U.S.S. Eagle 56, Accident or Target?
For many Americans on the home front, World War II must have seemed like a distant nightmare. While they tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in their daily lives, the fighting raged thousands of miles from home, on beaches and battlefields in Europe and in the Pacific. Naval engagements were fought in faraway places like Midway or Guadalcanal. But in fact, there was also fighting going on right off the United States coast. For most of the war, American waters from Maine to the Gulf of Mexico lay under siege. Less than a month after Pearl Harbor, German U-boats began to attack coastal shipping, sinking merchant vessels carrying vital war supplies. In 1942 alone, more than 60 American tankers and freighters went to the bottom off the U.S. East Coast, and nearly 1,000 merchant seamen died. The U-boat was one of Germany's most effective weapons. But even as it ravaged Allied shipping, sometimes just a few miles offshore, most Americans were still lulled into thinking that their coastline was secure.
The U-boats operated along the U.S. East Coast, particularly off some of the lighted cities such as Atlantic City and New York, where ships that were traveling were silhouetted by the lights along the coast. And of course, the German U-boats were able to see those ships passing by those lighted areas, and of course, they were able to fire torpedoes at them and sink many of them.
The U-boat patrols were an important part of German strategy. Unlike most warships, U-boats were not deployed as part of a fleet. Each sub was an independent weapons platform designed to seek out enemy shipping anywhere in the ocean and apply lethal force. A U-boat could approach without warning, fire a torpedo, and disappear while its victim went down. Volkmar Koenig served as an officer on several different U-boats. He remembers the thrill of the hunt.
If you got such a message and the machine was humming at high speed, you try to get in close contact to the enemy. This was action. And this was excitement, and the torpedo was shot, and you were counting the seconds till the torpedo hit. This was really what you were out at sea for. You wanted to sink ships. By this, you perhaps could force the enemy to its knees, yeah? Could win the Battle of the Atlantic.
Horst Bredow served on U-boats during World War II. Now he's the director of one of the world's foremost U-boat archives in Cuxhaven, Germany.
Churchill in seinen Memoiren geschrieben hat,
Churchill wrote in his memoirs, the only thing I was really scared of in this war was the German submarine fleet. He was no longer afraid of the Air Force, simply scared of the German submarine.
In spite of the U-boat threat, the Allies were not defenseless. There was new technology available, like sonar and radar, specialized sub-hunting aircraft, which dropped their own torpedoes, and improved versions of the depth charge, the standard anti-submarine weapon. A well-placed depth charge was something every U-boat officer dreaded.
When depth charges were exploding, first it was a terrible deafening noise, and then the boat would tremble, and if the depth charge were really near, then the light would go out because the bulb would break and only the auxiliary lighting would be on. And swish here and there because the water would come in. These are frightful situations.
Perhaps most important, naval intelligence gathering was getting better and better. Though it was kept secret from the public and even from most naval commanders, U.S. intelligence was able to decode encrypted German radio transmissions and track the movements of many U-boats. By 1944, anti-submarine warfare had begun to turn the tide against the Nazi subs. One of the oldest weapons in the American arsenal was a class of sub-chasers called the Eagle boats. Designated PE for patrol escort, the Eagles were commissioned at the end of World War I as a response to the earlier U-boat menace. But by the 1940s, after more than 2 decades of service, the Eagle boats seemed outdated, a throwback to an earlier generation and an earlier war. The men who would serve on one of those Eagles, the PE-56, felt it was their duty to help repel the enemy threat any way they could.
I was rather pleased about going into the Navy. I thought, well, maybe I could make this war end earlier.
It was a duty that they, had me doing, and I wanted to do well at it.
We wanted to do what we could for our country because what had happened at Pearl Harbor was a terrible thing. When something hits on your own shores, this is the thing to do. They can't come any farther.
Like the other Eagle boats, the Eagle 56 was a small warship, just 200 feet long from bow to stern, and she weighed a mere 500 tons. But she was outfitted with sonar to locate her prey and armed with machine guns and depth charges.
And they call it the Eagle because they said they wanted something like an eagle to scour the seas and get every German sub there was.
Though she was designed to hunt and kill submarines, the Eagle 56 spent much of the war engaged in training and weapons testing. Convoy escort assignments or search and destroy missions went to the newer and faster sub-chasers and destroyers. And no one would ever mistake the Eagle for a streamlined, heavily armed destroyer.
It was built by Henry Ford. They called them Henry Ford's ugly ducklings because there wasn't a trim line on her. The bow was perpendicular to the water, and the stack was perpendicular to the deck, and 200 feet 9 inches long. She was an ugly little thing.
With her assignments limited to coastal waters, the men of the Eagle 56 worked much closer to home than their comrades in Europe or the distant Pacific. One of the Eagle's crewmen was Ivor Westerland from Brockton, Massachusetts. His children still have fond memories of good times with their father, even during the war.
We're very fortunate because once every few weeks it would be coming into Boston, and he'd be able to get home on weekends to see us, and that was a good thing. And it was out of the combat areas, and everything was hunky-dory, and he was planning to come home safely.
The men of the Eagle 56 were not serving on the front lines, but they were proud of their work, and they enjoyed the camaraderie on the old sub-chaser.
It was a small enough ship so that we learned to get along with one another and get to know more about each other. And so it made everybody's job that much easier to do. There was a good spirit among all of us, like a team out to win a game.
In April 1945, with the war's end just a few weeks away, that game would suddenly turn deadly, and the men of the Eagle 56 would find themselves fighting for their lives.
History Undercover will continue in a moment. History Undercover now continues.
On the morning of April 23, 1945, the Eagle 56 set out from her base at Portland, Maine, sailing into nearby Casco Bay to take part in target training.
But it was humdrum. Yeah, it wasn't very exciting. The war never really hit us because we were always based in either Key West or Casco Bay, Maine, outside of any action.
Working off the coast of New England, the crews seemed to be well out of harm's way. The war in Europe was winding down, and with any luck, they could all go home soon. The Eagle's assignment was to tow targets for bombing practice by Navy torpedo bombers, something the crew had done many times before. Such training assignments were routine, even boring. But for the men, it was much better than being in combat.
It was clean. You had a bed to lie in every night, unless something happened that you were, you know, a catastrophe.
Just after noon, the Eagle was at a full stop in between exercises. She was in Casco Bay, 5 miles southeast of Cape Elizabeth.
I had gone down to my room, officers' quarters, and lay down in bed, I think, to take a nap.
I was down in the after-cruise quarters, and I was helping Oscar Davis with a crossword puzzle.
I had the 8 to 12 watch. I was in charge of the engine room. Everything in the engine room was perfect.
The Eagle was far from alone in Casco Bay. Nearby were several destroyers and other naval vessels operating near the entrance to Portland Harbor. Suddenly, with no warning, the Eagle was rocked by an explosion. The force of the blast lifted the 500-ton ship 3 feet out of the water and tore the vessel in two. A geyser of water shot nearly 300 feet into the air. On board, there was chaos.
There was this horrendous explosion, which bodily picked me up and threw me up against the bulkhead. And it was dark, and there were quite a few steam pipes that were busted, and steam was pouring out of that. So I felt I needed to get out of there very quickly.
It threw me headfirst into a locker, and a bunk hit me.
The deck just came up, you know, like this at an angle, compound angle, and threw me up in the air. It literally blew me out of my shoes.
We have 2 escape hatches back half. Now everybody was trying to get out. Ship's cook. He said, I can't swim. So I said, we got to get out of here before the ship sinks or suck us in, because the water was coming in pretty fast. And we both dove, and I never seen him again. He never came up.
The stern half of the Eagle 56 sank almost immediately, but the bow remained afloat for another 15 minutes. Many of the crewmen were killed instantly by the force of the explosion or by the impact of flying debris. Others were trapped inside the ship and carried to the bottom. The men who survived found themselves adrift in the cold waters of the Gulf of Maine, clinging to pieces of their ship.
I was in the water. It's covered with oil. The oil was in my throat.
I had no life preserver. I just had a shirt and a pair of pants on, and the water was pretty cold.
You couldn't feel anything. 38 degrees, you know. You don't have to be in the water very long before you get frigid.
I kicked off into the water and swam as far away as I could to avoid any suction of the ship that might pull me down.
I saw Jonesy's body, and I knew it was Jonesy because he was on watch. He had the 12 to 4 and in the fire room, and he had a rag around his head, floating face down in the water, you know, like this.
There were 1 or 2 of the sailors who were trying to swim, and I saw them as their head went down, and they began to sink. And there was nothing I could have done to save them.
Wingert, who was a fireman, he was having an awful time, and I gave him one of the shoring pieces of shoring that I had. And wasn't but a few seconds or minutes after that, a wave hit, and he went down.
I turned around and saw the bow, because the ship had broken in half.
That was one of the worst things I ever went through.
The Eagle was sinking, but what had caused the explosion? Within minutes, a destroyer in the area, U.S.S. Selfridge, made sonar contact with something down below and dropped depth charges. But after a few minutes, the Selfridge was forced to break off the attack in order to focus on the rescue of the Eagle survivors. A few hours after the Eagle 56 went down, The waters of Casco Bay were combed by a fleet of Navy vessels and aircraft. Diesel smoke had been spotted, and there were sonar contacts, evidence that a U-boat was lurking below. But no U-boat was located. The enemy, if it was there at all, remained hidden. And the cause of the explosion that sank the Eagle 56 would remain a mystery for now.
History Undercover will continue in a moment. History Undercover now continues.
In May 1945, in the aftermath of the sinking of the Eagle 56, the Navy established a court of inquiry to determine exactly why the ship had gone down. Out of her crew of 62 men, only 13 had survived. The first step was to interview the survivors, all of them still in the hospital in Portland, Maine. Some of the men reported that while they were in the water, they had seen a U-boat surface briefly and then dive again.
Davis was ahead of me, and he was looking off the port side, off the port quarter, the aft port quarter, and he said, "Hey, Breeze, look, there's a sub." I saw it, but it wasn't for 5 minutes or anything like that. I didn't have 5 minutes to look. In fact, there were 5 or 6 guys that saw it.
Several men reported that they had seen a red and yellow insignia on the sub's conning tower.
And they saw that. Now, it's not possible that a sailor who was floating around in the water would make that up.
They were taking me aboard ship, and I heard these boom, 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 you know, and I said, "What's that?" And one of the guys carrying my stretcher said, "We're just throwing some K-gun charges over. We got a ping from the sonar gear. They got a ping on something." Well, the Navy tried to say that it was the bow section of the ship that they were pinging, but I don't think so, that it was the submarine that they got the ping on.
The Court of Inquiry never pursued the U-boat sightings and for some reason ignored them in its findings. But there was every reason to suspect that a German submarine had been responsible. Right up to the last days of the war, German U-boats continued their deadly attacks off American shores. One of the U-boats operating off the U.S. coast in the last months of the war was the U-853, nicknamed by her crew Der Drahtseiltänzer, the tightrope walker. The U-853 was built for stealth and armed to the teeth. Equipped with diesel engines and electric motors, 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns, and 22 torpedoes. At her helm was a 24-year-old lieutenant named Helmut Fromsdorf. He was new to his command and had yet to sink his first enemy ship. The Navy was keeping track of the movements of the U-853 and other U-boats. At a top-secret decryption center in Washington, known as Op-20G, Naval Intelligence was monitoring and decoding U-boat radio transmissions, mostly weather bulletins sent back to German naval headquarters. In fact, the Allies had been decoding enemy messages throughout the war, using their own version of the German Enigma coding machine. The decoding efforts were so sensitive that few people, even inside the military, were informed about them.
We would pick up on their reports back to Germany, and by doing that, we could also fix the locations of the U-boats. And those were highly classified records at the time. That information was held very closely in the Navy, and even people with top-secret clearances were not able to see those records.
In spite of the secrecy, the intelligence enabled Allied Naval Command to reroute convoys and avoid U-boats, saving thousands of tons in war supplies from probable destruction. In April 1945, Navy codebreakers were tracking the U-853 as she entered the Gulf of Maine and sailed along Casco Bay. They knew she was there on April 23rd, the very day that the Eagle 56 went down. But this information would remain classified for more than 50 years. Could this have been the submarine that the Eagle survivors reported seeing after the explosion that destroyed their ship? As the U-853 continued south past Cape Cod and the Navy was interviewing the Eagle 56 survivors, the war in Europe was reaching its dramatic conclusion. Germany was finally heading toward the inevitable surrender. On May 4th, almost 2 weeks after the Eagle disaster, the German High Command transmitted a radio dispatch ordering all U-boats to cease fire immediately and end hostile action against Allied shipping. Commander Fromsdorf of the U-853 may never have received the message. Communication between naval headquarters and the U-boats off distant shores was uncertain at best. It is also possible that Fromsdorf deliberately chose to ignore the order. In the war's final hours, discipline throughout the German military was breaking down.
I mean, everybody with open eyes knew that Germany had lost the war. The end of the war, in fact, was totally chaotic. Nobody really knew what was going on. The boats were supposed to sink themselves in case of a lost war.
For whatever reason, Commander Fromsdorf of the U-853 continued sailing south. On May 5th, the U-853 scored its final kill in the waters south of Narragansett Bay in Block Island Sound. The SS Black Point was a 5,500-ton collier bound for Boston with a load of coal. At 5:35 in the afternoon, the Black Point was hit by a torpedo. She sank in less than 20 minutes, taking 12 men down with her. The Black Point would be the last ship sunk by a U-boat in American waters. Within a few hours, the Hunter was being hunted by a flotilla of 11 destroyers and other warships assisted by Navy blimps. Leading the assault was the destroyer U.S.S. Atherton. The Atherton pounded the U-boat with depth charges. Late that evening, the U-853 appeared to have been hit as oil and debris rose to the surface. But the attack continued throughout the night, battering the stricken sub with a total of 15 tons of explosives. By mid-morning on May 6th, it was all over for the German sub and her 55 officers and men. Today, the U-853 still lies where she went down, in 130 feet of water, less than 7 miles east of Block Island. The day after the 853 sank, a Navy diver went down to investigate. He found the U-boat's hatch filled with the bodies of officers and crewmen wearing escape equipment. And on her conning tower was a painted insignia, a red horse on a yellow shield, matching the description from an Eagle 56 survivor. But as the Navy continued to investigate the sinking of the Eagle 56, the survivor's testimony was brushed aside. So was the corroborating evidence at the bottom of Narragansett Bay. Incredibly, Navy investigators preferred a very different explanation. They blamed the Eagle's own boilers. The explosion had occurred near the ship's midpoint, where the boilers were located. But the Eagle's surviving crew could not believe that the fault lay inside their ship. Machinists testified that the Eagle's engines and boilers were all in good repair, having been cleaned and inspected just a few weeks before. Curiously, no one ever asked the chief engineer about it.
I was the engineering officer. I helped to inspect that boiler. We tested that boiler. The pressure was set for 250. That's its operating pressure. In testing it, we tested up to 350 pounds. And then we see whether or not it maintains that pressure, if there's any cracks anywhere or anything. Perfect.
Like John Scagnelli, machinist's mate Harold Peterson was convinced that the engines were not the cause of the explosion.
Everything was in order, all pressures proper, vacuums. It was not a boiler explosion. It couldn't be a boiler explosion. I don't know how they can say it.
I question how thorough was that board of inquiry? Where were the expert witnesses? Who did they talk to?
Despite the incomplete nature of the investigation, the Court of Inquiry reached its conclusion that the sinking was the result of a boiler explosion, the cause of which could not be determined. The men of the Eagle 56 had died in the line of duty, but not as the result of enemy action.
I was amazed. I was amazed how they could ever come up with such a determination, because a boiler, 250 pounds of steam, they couldn't do that. Break a ship's keel? No, come on. An impossibility. It's a physical impossibility.
I naturally thought, this is awful. How can they say that? You know, even whenever we were questioned, and I'm sure at the inquiry, that we had told them that we thought it was an outside explosion.
I felt saddened that so many of the families may have thought we were incompetent. To think that we would permit a ship to go out and have a boiler explosion, I mean, that's you know, like, that's bordering on negligence. And I knew deep down that we had done everything possible to assure that everything was in tip-top shape.
Why did the court disregard the eyewitness accounts and the evidence? The Navy may have had its reasons, but they would remain hidden for decades. History Undercover will continue in a moment. History Undercover now continues. In June 1945, the Navy's Court of Inquiry completed its report on the Eagle 56 sinking, concluding that it was most likely the result of a boiler explosion. As Commandant of the 1st Naval District, which included Portland, Maine, it was up to Rear Admiral Felix Gygax to sign off on the ruling. Clearly, he had misgivings about the court's findings. In fact, he amended them, acknowledging that the Eagle 56 could have been sunk by something outside the ship, like an enemy torpedo. Amended, but officially unchanged, the ruling maintained that no enemy action was involved. So the 49 officers and crewmen killed on the Eagle, as well as the injured survivors, were not eligible for the Purple Heart, recognition of their sacrifice in war.
The whole thing is baffling to me. Many people have said, well, simply that maybe the naval people didn't want people to know that there was German submarines along the coast. And how did they get in so close? Maybe it impacted on the competency of the people.
As the highest-ranking survivor, John Scagnelli was ordered to send letters to the families of the deceased. He couldn't tell them what he and the other men believed, that their loved ones had died in combat.
What I really tried to do was to make the loss of their son meaningful to each of the parents or their wives. To try to say to them that their husbands or their sons had a great part in the fighting of the war. That was the most difficult thing to have to do for each one of them.
The thing that's bothered me the most about it all is the mothers and fathers that passed away thinking somebody aboard that ship was negligent and blew the boilers up and killed my son. Now, this was never stated, but I know they had to think that. I thought it, that they were thinking it. And I only wish that they could have seen that their sons were heroes, you know? It's quite a different thing, a mysterious explosion or being torpedoed in action.
For the widow of Ivor Westerland, one of the men who went down with the Eagle, the loss was an almost unbearable shock.
I received a telegram stating that he was missing. They presumed he was dead. I didn't believe it. I was really in a stupor. I really didn't believe such a thing happened.
I was only 8 when we heard my dad was missing at sea, and we had just seen him that weekend. And I remember going home that day from school feeling really cheated.
As the 4 Westerland children grew up, they accepted the official story that the sinking of the Eagle 56 had been caused by a boiler explosion. It was only years later that 2 of the sons, Bob and Paul Westerland, began to suspect a U-boat.
There were no indications of what had really happened until we came across a couple of, articles, and then things kind of dawned on us that maybe it was this German sub. And And that was always in the back of our heads, and my mom always said that she thought it was a submarine that had caused the accident.
You know, we knew there were subs off our coast. He didn't die because of an accident aboard ship.
The surviving crewmen also insisted that the Navy's official records had it wrong.
At no time did I think that it was a boiler explosion. No way.
5 or 6 guys testified to the fact that they saw the submarine.
Was it a U-boat or an accident? As Bob and Paul continued to examine the story more closely, they realized that they'd need the help of an expert to uncover the truth. In 1998, they found a valuable ally, Paul Lawton, a family friend. Lawton is a lawyer and historian with a passion for U-boats.
Midship, so we're looking for 2 sections, both roughly 100 feet in length.
There were letters to the Westerland family. In those letters, it indicated that the ship was lost as a result of a catastrophic boiler explosion. Now, immediately, that didn't make any sense to me. I had never heard of any other modern warship in World War II being lost to a catastrophic boiler explosion.
Over the years, he obtained documents from the National Archives and other collections, hoping to persuade the Navy to re-examine the case.
It became true obsession, and every day that I'd receive new records from National Archives, and I'd open them up and find new evidence, it really just kept the machine going. The evidence just continued to grow, and we realized a couple of years ago that we were on something that was really big, and it turned out to be something that is completely unprecedented in naval history.
When he sought additional files from the Court of Inquiry, Lawton ran into a brick wall. Or was he being stonewalled?
Several months later, I received a letter back from the Judge Advocate General claiming that all records pertaining to the loss of the Eagle 56 were lost from their long-term storage facility. My feeling was cover-up because of the fact that there were usually duplicates of these records stored in multiple repositories.
Determined to locate the missing pieces of the puzzle, Lawton appealed to his congressman at the time, the late Joseph Moakley. Congressman Moakley helped open the doors at the Naval Historical Center in Washington, the principal repository for the Navy's wartime records.
Upon reading the Court of Inquiry, I knew something was really amiss. When you read through the transcript, it was fractured and appeared that there were parts deleted or removed and redacted.
Unfortunately, Lawton found that many of the files connected with the Eagle 56 were still classified. The answers would be hard to find without help from the top. In the fall of 2000, Lawton petitioned the Secretary of Defense to reopen the case. It became a political football. The Secretary turned the case over to the Judge Advocate General, who then forwarded the matter to the Naval Historical Center. There, a research team was put together, including Bernard Cavalcanti, a historian who already knew a great deal about the Eagle 56 and about German U-boats like the U-853.
Having worked with the captured German naval archives for very many years, close to 35 years, I understood those records as well as the fact that we also had the Navy's anti-submarine warfare records, convoy and routing records, which all played a part in the Battle of the Atlantic.
With these records, Lawton could piece together the real story and the reasons for the Navy's decision in 1945. History Undercover will continue in a moment. History Undercover now continues. In the spring of 1945, when the Navy undertook its original inquiry into the sinking of the Eagle 56, the testimony and the evidence seemed to point to a U-boat, not a boiler explosion. The Navy's own records, recently declassified, appear to confirm it. Naval intelligence records tracking the U-853 as it sailed down the New England coast placed it in the Gulf of Maine, right around the time of the Eagle's sinking. It should have been a prime suspect, but none of this information was made available to the Court of Inquiry. Paul Lawton was only able to uncover it nearly 60 years later.
It turned out that the intelligence regarding German U-boat operations was quite extensive at that time. As a matter of fact, they
pretty much tracked the U-853 from Norway into the Gulf of Maine. They identified the submarine by its number 853, and believe it or not, they actually knew the commander's name, Framsdorf.
Even the survivors' reports of yellow and red markings on a U-boat's conning tower linked the Eagle's sinking with the U-853. Why had the court insisted on ignoring the evidence? The fact that the Navy could decipher German-coded messages was still top secret at the end of the war.
That information was so highly classified that it was not shared with the local commanders in the Eastern Sea frontier, and particularly it was not shared with the individuals who were convening the Court of Inquiry.
Beyond the security issues, it may also have been a matter of timing. By early May 1945, the Navy's top brass had already turned their full attention to the war in the Pacific.
A lot of people were making moves and getting ready to fight Japan, or perhaps even invade Japan at that time. And so the entire war effort shifted from the Atlantic to the Pacific. I don't think it was the Navy's fault. It was just a matter of just dropping through the cracks.
Still, the Navy couldn't afford to appear complacent about a lingering threat from U-boats, especially just a few miles offshore. Paul Lawton thinks this may have been a concern for the local commander in Maine.
I can only speculate that the individual who convened the Court of Inquiry happened to be the commanding officer of the Portland Naval Base. And it's clear to me that the commanding officer of that naval base, who was directly responsible for the loss of any ships under his watch and personnel, had a lot to gain by having a finding other than enemy action.
Though we may never be certain why the court reached the decision it did, Paul Lawton believes the evidence supports a very different conclusion.
All of the witness statements dovetailed perfectly with the official records that we received from a number of sources and clearly were opposed to the findings in the Court of Inquiry. So we had two stories, and really it came down to which one you believe after reading all the documentation.
After scouring the records, Lawton and naval historian Bernard Cavalcante believed they had a solid case.
I was able to get the documentation necessary to send a letter to the Secretary of the Navy asking that the men be awarded Purple Hearts. And, of course, Secretary of the Navy, England, signed off on, concurred with the evidence that I sent up with the letter. And at that point, it was official that U.S.S. Eagle was sunk by a U-boat, U-853 to be exact.
On June 23, 2001, more than a half-century after the U.S.S. Eagle 56 went down, the cause of her sinking was formally changed. The Navy declared that she had indeed been the target of a German U-boat.
Finally, it had come to rest. All of the survivors had felt that it was not an explosion. It was either a mine or a torpedo or something. And that was always in the back of my mind. And so I felt relieved that there'd been a conclusion to this thing.
Something like this has never happened before. 57 years after the fact, the Navy admits it makes a mistake. Unheard of.
You began to think about what happened and all of the people that died and how many years it has taken for the Navy to set it right. And you don't feel good about that. You don't feel good about it.
And for the Navy to admit that it's wrong, that's a big deal. I mean, it's the first time I ever heard it happening.
The decision was indeed unprecedented.
In all the years that I've here, I've never known about anyone changing the cause of sinking of a ship after all those years. I think it's a precedent.
For many, it meant an end to years of doubt and heartache.
The most important thing, and I'd be an idiot if I thought any differently, is that my 49 shipmates that perished that day are finally going to be honored for what they did. That's the big thing.
One final act remained in the saga of the Eagle 56. On June 9, 2002, on the deck of the U.S.S. Salem in Quincy, Massachusetts, the last three survivors of the Eagle 56, John Scagnelli, John Breeze and Harold Peterson were reunited. Together again for the first time since 1945. Scagnelli, Peterson, and the families of those who had died would be honored with one of America's highest military decorations, the Purple Heart.
It's a great honor to have you men here today. First, would like to present the Purple Heart to Lieutenant Scagnelli. Now to Harold Peterson.
This was a proud moment for the survivors of the Eagle crew. It had been a long time in coming. For the family of Ivor Westerland, their quest was finally over. At last, there was official recognition that their beloved husband and father had died in action, not in an accident.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
George Sabatino, Edward Joseph Schneider.
In a moving ceremony, the 3 Eagle survivors honored their lost shipmates.
John Joseph Alexander. James Orville Brown. And those who survived but are now deceased, Oscar Davis.
Perhaps no one was more pleased than John Scagnelli. As the officer in charge of the ship's boilers, Scagnelli had been made to feel responsible for the sinking. Now, that burden was officially lifted.
But now that I've got a Purple Heart, I can say, well, sure, we were out there. We got hit by a German sub, and we got a Purple Heart to prove it. And so will the other families as well. So it's sort of a nice feeling now. You know, you feel proud about it.
I think he'd be happy knowing that his sons pursued an idea that they had many, many years ago. It's just a symbol, a recognition of what happened to these men.
One of my daughters said, "You know, you're a hero, Dad." I said, I disabused her of that fact in a hurry. I said, the only heroes I know sleep at the bottom of the Pacific, the Atlantic Ocean, on the Atlantic shelf off of Cape Elizabeth. That's the heroes, not me. I'm one of the lucky ones.
This has brought the PE-56 and the crew back to the surface because everybody's talking about them, everybody's seeing their pictures, everybody's reading the story, everybody's, it's changed from internal explosion to torpedoed and sunken action. They're living again for a while.
After nearly 6 decades, the story of the Eagle 56 has finally emerged from obscurity. And for her crew, there is vindication, long delayed, and a badge of honor.
There was another honor handed out in the spring of 2002. After the 3 living Eagle survivors received their Purple Hearts, they presented a plaque to Paul Lawton, the lawyer and historian who took up their cause. The plaque was engraved with the image of a warship being hit by an enemy torpedo. It was a tribute to one man's obsessive quest for the truth. For the History Channel, I'm Arthur Kent. Thanks for watching.